In the shadowed cellars of Chateau Vigne, a priceless 1787 Chateau Lafite vanishes, along with its owner, the eccentric wine collector Etienne Dubois. Was it greed, envy, or a darker secret that spirited him away? Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eye and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of deception among a cunning buyer, a bitter rival, a nervous guide, and a silent worker. Hidden tunnels, staged clues, and a single pebble lead her to a truth as intoxicating as the wine itself. Who stole the bottle? And the man? The answer lies in the heart of Provence, where every sip hides a motive. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Chateau Vigne. Miss Jane Marple sat in her neat sitting room in St. Mary Mead, the soft click of her knitting needles punctuating the quiet afternoon. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the worn rug. On the table beside her, amid a scatter of gardening catalogues and a half-finished letter to her nephew, lay an envelope postmarked from France. Its elegant script bore the name of Sir Henry Clithering, her old friend and former Scotland Yard commissioner, whose invitations, she knew, were rarely without purpose. The letter was an intriguing one. Sir Henry, now retired and indulging his taste for fine wines, wrote of a private tour at Chateau Vigne, a prestigious vineyard nestled in the rolling hills of Provence. The estate belonged to Monsieur Etienne Dubois, a collector whose cellar housed bottles of such rarity that they were whispered about in the most exclusive circles. Sir Henry's tone was light, but Miss Marple detected a thread of unease beneath his words. "There's talk of rivalries among the guests," he wrote, "and I'd value your company, dear Jane, for your knack of seeing what others miss." Her eyes twinkled at the compliment, though she suspected he sought more than her companionship. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her mind turning over the invitation. St. Mary Mead, with its petty squabbles and predictable scandals, had grown quiet of late, and the prospect of a journey stirred her curiosity. She pictured the chateau, a stone relic of old France, its vineyards heavy with grapes, its cellar a treasure trove of secrets. People, she reflected, were much the same, whether in a village or a vineyard. Their desires and jealousies followed them like shadows. With a decisive nod, she rose, fetched her modest suitcase from the attic, and began to pack, selecting her plain but serviceable dresses and a warm shawl for the cool evenings. The journey to Provence was a study in contrasts. The rattling train from London to Dover, the choppy crossing of the Channel, and finally the smooth glide of the French railway through fields of lavender and sunflowers. Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watched the landscape with quiet appreciation, her thoughts drifting to the people she would meet. Sir Henry's letter had named a few: a wine buyer, a rival collector, a local, worker, and the estate's guide. Each, she mused, would bring their own motives to the table, as predictable yet varied as the stitches in her knitting. At Avignon, a chauffeured car awaited, sent by Chateau Vigne. The drive to the estate wound through narrow lanes, past stone walls draped in ivy. The chateau itself was a vision of timeless elegance. Its towers rose against a sky streaked with pink, and its windows glinted in the late summer sun. Sir Henry greeted her at the entrance, his robust figure and warm smile a welcome sight. "Jane, you're a marvel for coming," he said, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. "This place is splendid, but there's something brewing. I feel it." They were ushered into a grand hall, where Monsieur Etienne Dubois awaited. He was a slight man, no taller than Miss Marple, with sharp features and eyes that darted like a hawk's. His manner was polished, yet there was a restless energy about him, as if he were always tallying the value of the room. "Mademoiselle Marple," he said, bowing slightly, "your reputation precedes you. I trust you'll find my collection enlightening." His smile was tight, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his hand as he gestured toward the other guests. The group was small, but varied. Madame Claudine Lefebvre, a Parisian wine buyer, stood with the poise of a woman accustomed to command, her crimson hat a bold contrast to her sleek black dress. Her questions about the cellar were precise, almost proprietary. Monsieur Gaston Renard, a rival collector, was a heavy-set man with a florid face, his voice loud and his gestures expansive, as if to compensate for some inner lack. Mademoiselle Sophie Martel, the guide, was younger, her delicate features framed by dark curls, her smile professional, but strained. Pierre Bouchard, a local worker, stood apart, his rough hands clasped tightly, his eyes fixed on the polished floor. Dinner was served in a dining room adorned with tapestries, the table gleaming with crystal and silver. Dubois spoke passionately of his collection, his voice rising as he described a 1787 Chateau Lafite, a bottle so rare it was said to have once belonged to a king. Miss Marple listened, her mild gaze moving from face to face. Madame Lefebvre's interest seemed more than professional, her fingers tightening on her glass. Renard's laughter was too hearty, his eyes narrowing at Dubois' every word. Sophie's hands fidgeted with her napkin, while Pierre, silent, seemed to shrink into his chair. As the meal ended, Dubois announced a tour of the cellar for the following morning. "A privilege," he called it, his eyes gleaming with pride. Miss Marple smiled politely, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The chateau, with its opulence and its undercurrents, reminded her of a vicarage tea party, where smiles hid sharp tongues. She retired to her room, a cozy chamber overlooking the vineyards, and sat by the window, her knitting needles resuming their rhythm. The invitation had promised wine, but she suspected the true vintage would be human nature, complex, unpredictable, and perhaps a little dangerous. Chapter 2. The Cellar's Secrets. The morning sun cast a golden haze over Chateau Vigne, its rays filtering through the vineyard's dew-kissed leaves. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in a sensible tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan, descended the chateau's grand staircase, her eyes bright with anticipation. The air carried the faint scent of lavender and freshly baked bread from the kitchens, but her thoughts were on the cellar tour promised by Monsieur Etienne Dubois. Sir Henry Clithering, waiting in the hall, offered her his arm with a gallant smile. "Ready for the adventure, Jane?" he asked, his tone light but his glance searching. "Always, Sir Henry," she replied, her voice soft but laced with a quiet resolve. She had slept well, her dreams untroubled by the undercurrents she'd sensed at dinner, yet her mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of the group's interactions. The cellar, she suspected, would reveal more than bottles. It would be a stage for human nature, where greed and envy might slip their masks. The group gathered in the chateau's courtyard, where the air was warm and the cicadas hummed. Monsieur Dubois stood at the center, his wiry frame taut with energy, his sharp eyes scanning his guests. Madame Claudine Lefebvre, resplendent in a tailored emerald dress and a wide-brimmed hat, adjusted her gloves with a precision that suggested calculation. Monsieur Gaston Renard, his waistcoat straining slightly, mopped his brow with a silk handkerchief, his loud voice already filling the space with complaints about the morning's heat. Mademoiselle Sophie Martel, the guide, stood poised beside Dubois, her dark curls pinned neatly, though her fingers toyed nervously with a silver locket at her throat. Pierre Bouchard, the worker, lingered at the group's edge, his weathered face impassive, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his rough jacket. Dubois clapped his hands, drawing attention. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his French accent crisp. "Today, you will see a collection unmatched in all of Europe. My cellar is not merely a storehouse, it is a testament to history, to taste, to triumph." His eyes gleamed, and Miss Marple noted the pride in his voice, tinged with something sharper, defiance, perhaps, or a challenge to those who might covet his treasures. He led them toward a heavy oak door at the base of the chateau, its iron hinges rusted with age. Sophie stepped forward, unlocking it with a large key, and the group descended a stone staircase into the cool, shadowed depths. The cellar was a marvel of architecture, its vaulted ceilings supported by arches of weathered stone. The air was damp, heavy with the earthy scent of mold and the faint sweetness of fermented grapes. Torches flickered in iron sconces, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Rows of oak racks stretched into the distance, each cradling bottles coated in a fine layer of dust. Miss Marple, her steps careful on the uneven floor, felt the weight of centuries in the silence, broken only by the soft tread of the group and Dubois' reverent commentary. Sophie took over, her voice clear, but with a slight tremor, as she described the collection's highlights. "Here," she said, gesturing to a rack of Bordeaux, "are vintages from the 19th century, preserved through wars and revolutions." Her knowledge was impressive, yet Miss Marple noticed her eyes flicking toward Dubois, as if seeking approval. Madame Lefebvre, walking beside her, asked pointed questions about the bottle's provenance, her tone sharp and probing. "And the 1787 Chateau Lafite?" she pressed, her gloved fingers brushing a nearby rack. "Its authenticity is certain, I presume?" Dubois answered before Sophie could, his voice firm. "Madame, every bottle in my collection is verified. The Lafite is no exception. It is a jewel, once owned by a noble family, its journey traced through auction houses to my hands." His smile was tight, and Miss Marple caught the briefest glance of irritation he shot toward Lefebvre. Reynard, trailing behind, snorted softly. "A jewel you've hoarded, Dubois," he muttered, loud enough for the group to hear. "Some of us would have shared such a prize." Miss Marple, pretending to adjust her shawl, observed Reynard's flushed cheeks and the way his hand clenched his handkerchief. Envy, she thought, was a powerful force, and Reynard wore it like a second skin. Pierre, silent at the rear, kept his eyes on the floor, but his posture was tense, as if the cellar's confines made him uneasy. Sophie, meanwhile, led them deeper, her narration faltering only when Dubois interjected with details she seemed reluctant to share. They reached a narrower passage where the air grew colder and the torchlight dimmer. Dubois paused before a heavy iron gate, its bars wrought in an intricate pattern of vines. "Beyond this," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "lies my private collection. Few have seen it, and fewer still will." He produced a small key from his waistcoat pocket, its brass glinting in the torchlight. The gate creaked as it swung open, revealing a chamber smaller than the others, its walls lined with shelves that held bottles of extraordinary age. The group pressed forward, their breaths catching at the sight. At the chamber's center, on a pedestal of polished wood, stood the 1787 Chateau Lafite, its label faded but legible, its glass dark with age. Dubois' face softened as he gazed at it, his fingers hovering as if to caress the bottle. "This," he said, "is the heart of my collection. Its value is not merely in gold, but in history. It is irreplaceable." Madame Lefebvre's eyes narrowed, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, but she remained silent. Reynard's jaw tightened, and Miss Marple noted the way his hand twitched, as if resisting an urge to reach out. Sophie's voice, when she resumed, was strained, her words about the bottle's history mechanical. Pierre, standing near a stack of empty crates, shifted his weight, his eyes darting to the shadows. Miss Marple, her gaze mild but unyielding, watched him closely. His discomfort was palpable, and she wondered what tied him to this place beyond his work. The cellar, she thought, was not just a repository of wine, but a mirror of its keeper's obsessions, and perhaps those of others. Suddenly, a sharp crash echoed from the passage above, the sound of wood splintering and glass shattering. The group froze, their faces illuminated by the flickering torches. Sophie gasped, her hand flying to her locket. "A crate must have fallen," she said, her voice high. "I'll check." She hurried toward the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Dubois, his expression darkening, called after her, but she was already gone. The group waited, the air thick with unease. Madame Lefebvre adjusted her hat, her movements deliberate, while Reynard muttered about careless workers. Pierre's hands clenched at his sides, his eyes fixed on the gate. Miss Marple, standing near the pedestal, let her fingers brush the edge of a nearby shelf, noting the dust disturbed in faint streaks, as if something had been moved recently. She said nothing, but her mind catalogued the detail, as precise as her knitting patterns. Minutes passed, and Sophie returned, her face pale. "It was just a crate of empty bottles," she said, though her eyes avoided Dubois. "Nothing to worry about." Dubois nodded curtly, but his attention seemed elsewhere. He turned back to the Lafite, his hand reaching for the key in his pocket. "Let us continue," he said, stepping toward the gate to lock it. But as he moved, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a shift in the group's formation. In the moment of distraction, with all eyes on Sophie or the gate, Dubois was no longer at the pedestal. She blinked, her heart quickening, and scanned the chamber. The gate was locked, the key still in Dubois' pocket, or so it seemed. Yet he was gone. The Lafite bottle, too, was missing from its pedestal, leaving only a faint ring of dust in its place. Sir Henry's voice broke the silence. "Where's Dubois?" he demanded, his tone sharp. The group turned, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. Madame Lefebvre's hand flew to her throat, her composure cracking. Reynard's bluster faltered, his eyes darting to the gate. Sophie's locket slipped from her fingers, clattering to the stone floor. Pierre stepped back, his expression unreadable, but his shoulders tense. Miss Marple, her hands folded calmly, surveyed the scene. The chamber was sealed, the gate locked, the only exit the staircase they'd descended. No one could have left unseen, yet Dubois had vanished, as if swallowed by the cellar's shadows. She glanced at the disturbed dust on the shelf, then at the crates near Pierre, where a faint scuff mark marred the floor. Her lips pursed slightly, but she said nothing, her mind already weaving a pattern from the threads of what she'd seen. "Stay where you are," Sir Henry commanded, his Scotland Yard instincts resurfacing. He strode to the gate, testing its lock, but it held firm. Sophie, trembling, produced a spare key from her pocket, but it too failed to open the gate from the inside. Madame Lefebvre's voice, usually so controlled, rose sharply. "This is impossible. He was here a moment ago." Renard's face reddened. "What kind of trick is this, Dubois?" he bellowed, as if expecting the man to reappear. Pierre said nothing, his eyes fixed on a point in the shadows. Miss Marple, her expression serene, knelt to retrieve Sophie's locket, handing it back with a gentle smile. "We mustn't panic," she said softly. "There's always an explanation, however strange it seems." Sir Henry sent Sophie to fetch the chateau's staff, and soon the cellar echoed with footsteps as workers and gendarmes arrived. Inspecteur Laurent, a lean man with a meticulous mustache, took charge, his questions sharp but methodical. He examined the gate, the pedestal, the chamber's walls, but found no trace of Dubois or the Lafitte. The group was ushered upstairs, their faces pale in the daylight, and Miss Marple lingered at the rear, her eyes lingering on the scuff mark by the crates. In the drawing room, as the police began their inquiries, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles resuming their rhythm. The cellar's secrets, she thought, were not in its bottles, but in the hearts of those who coveted them. Dubois' disappearance was no accident. It was a move in a game she had yet to fully understand. But the board was set, and she would watch each player closely, for in their glances, their silences, and their lies, the truth would surely emerge. Chapter 3. The Search Begins. The grand drawing room of Chateau Vigne, with its high ceilings and tapestries depicting pastoral scenes, felt stifling despite the open windows, letting in the warm Provençal breeze. The group, still shaken from the cellar's events, sat in uneasy silence, their eyes darting between one another and the door where Inspecteur Laurent's gendarmes came and went. Miss Jane Marple, perched on a velvet-upholstered chair, her knitting bag at her side, appeared the picture of calm, her needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue scarf. Yet her mild eyes missed nothing, the way Madame Claudine Lefebvre's fingers tightened around her fan, Monsieur Gaston Renard's restless pacing, Mademoiselle Sophie Martel's bitten lip, and Pierre Bouchard's rigid stillness by the fireplace. Sir Henry Clithering, his face set with the authority of his Scotland Yard days, stood by the hearth, addressing the group. "We must remain orderly," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Monsieur Dubois cannot have vanished into thin air. We'll search the cellar, the chateau, and the grounds. No one leaves until Inspecteur Laurent gives permission." His gaze lingered on Renard, whose scowl deepened as if the command were a personal affront. Inspecteur Laurent, entering with a notebook in hand, exuded the confidence of a man who trusted procedure above all else. His mustache twitched as he surveyed the group, his dark eyes narrowing. "Monsieur Dubois was last seen by the iron gate, oui?" he began, his tone clipped. "The gate was locked, the key in his pocket, yet he is gone. This is no ghost story. Someone knows something." He fixed each guest with a stare, but Miss Marple noted his questions were broad, lacking the precision needed to unravel the knot before them. Sophie spoke first, her voice faltering. "I was upstairs, checking the fallen crate. It was just broken glass, empty bottles. When I returned, he was gone." Her fingers twisted her locket, and Miss Marple observed the faint flush on her cheeks, as if the memory of her brief absence carried a weight she dared not share. Madame Lefebvre, her composure regained, spoke next, her words measured. "I was admiring the Lafitte when the crash came. I turned, and then he wasn't there." Her eyes, sharp behind her elegant spectacles, flicked to Reynard, who snorted. "Ridiculous," Reynard said, his voice booming. "I was right beside Dubois, discussing a Margot from 45. He didn't slip past me." His hands gestured expansively, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in them, betraying nerves beneath his bluster. Pierre, when pressed, offered only a curt, "I saw nothing. I was by the crates." His eyes remained fixed on the floor, and Miss Marple wondered what kept him so guarded, as if words might betray more than silence. Inspecteur Laurent scribbled notes, then dispatched his men to search the cellar again. Sir Henry, restless, suggested the group accompany them to retrace their steps, and Laurent agreed, provided they stayed under watch. Miss Marple, rising with a gentle smile, tucked her knitting into her bag. "A second look is always wise," she murmured to Sir Henry, who nodded, sensing her mind was already at work. The cellar, bathed in the harsh light of portable lamps brought by the gendarmes, felt less mysterious, but no less oppressive. The stone arches loomed overhead, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth. Laurent's men examined every corner, tapping walls for hidden panels and checking the iron gate's lock, which remained stubbornly intact. Miss Marple, lingering near the pedestal where the Lafitte had stood, let her eyes wander to the scuff mark she'd noticed earlier, near a stack of dusty barrels. It was faint, a crescent of disturbed dirt, but to her it spoke as clearly as a shout. She knelt, as if adjusting her shoe, and ran her finger along the mark, confirming its freshness. The barrel beside it, she noted, was slightly askew, its base not flush with the others. "Inspecteur," she called softly, her voice carrying a deceptive mildness. "Might you look at this barrel? It seems out of place." Laurent, frowning, approached, his men following. They shifted the barrel, revealing nothing but the stone floor beneath, yet Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the space, her mind turning over possibilities. Laurent dismissed the mark as irrelevant. Servants moving supplies, no doubt. But she tucked the observation away, like a stitch held for later. The search extended to the chateau's upper floors, its labyrinth of corridors and rooms offering countless hiding places. Miss Marple, accompanied by a young gendarme, explored the guest wing, her steps slow but deliberate. She paused by a window overlooking the vineyards, noting a path that wound toward a cluster of outbuildings. "Does that lead to the old servants' quarters?" she asked the gendarme, who nodded, surprised by her interest in such a detail. She smiled, thanking him, and filed the information away, recalling the chateau's history of hidden passages from her reading in the library the previous night. Back in the drawing room, the group reconvened, their faces drawn. Laurent reported no sign of Dubois, though his men had found a broken bottle in the passage where Sophie had heard the crash. "An accident, perhaps," he said, but his tone suggested he doubted it. Sir Henry, pacing, pressed for a search of the grounds, and Laurent agreed, sending gendarmes to comb the vineyards and stables. Miss Marple, resuming her knitting, listened as the group's tensions surfaced. Madame Lefebvre, her fan snapping shut, remarked, "This is no mere accident. That Lafitte is worth a fortune. Someone saw their chance." Her glance at Renard was pointed, and he bristled. "Accusing me, madame?" he snapped. "I'd wager you know more about disappearing bottles than I do." Sophie, pale, interjected. "Please, we mustn't fight. Monsieur Dubois might be hurt." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes avoided Pierre, who stood silent, his hands clenched. As the afternoon wore on, Laurent questioned the chateau's staff, who reported nothing unusual beyond the fallen crate. Miss Marple, sipping tea brought by a nervous maid, engaged Sophie in quiet conversation. "You've worked here a year, my dear?" she asked, her tone grandmotherly. Sophie nodded, her fingers twisting her locket again. "Yes, since last summer. Monsieur Dubois is particular, but fair." Her hesitation, Miss Marple thought, was telling, as if loyalty warred with some unspoken fear. Sir Henry, joining them, whispered to Miss Marple, "This is a puzzle, Jane. No exits, no signs of struggle, yet he's gone. And that bottle? Why take it?" She nodded, her eyes on her knitting. "People, Sir Henry, are rarely as clever as they think. The answer is here, in what they do or don't do." Her gaze drifted to Pierre, who had moved to the window, staring at the vineyards as if they held answers he could not voice. As dusk fell, a gendarme burst in, holding a small object aloft. "Inspecteur, we found this near the vineyard's edge." It was a cufflink, silver with an engraved D, unmistakably Dubois. Laurent's eyes lit up, and he declared it evidence Dubois had fled, perhaps to protect his precious Lafitte. Miss Marple, examining the cufflink when Laurent passed it around, noted its polished surface, free of dirt or wear. "Curious," she murmured, her voice so soft only Sir Henry heard. "Too clean for a man running through a vineyard, don't you think?" The group dispersed to their rooms, under orders to remain in the chateau. Miss Marple, retiring to her own, sat by the window, her knitting idle for once. The cufflink, the scuff mark, the locked gate, all were pieces of a pattern, like the motifs in her lacework. Someone had orchestrated Dubois' disappearance, and the Lafitte's absence was no coincidence. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how greed could twist even the most respectable hearts. Here, in the opulence of Chateau Vigne, the stakes were higher, but the impulses were the same. She closed her eyes, letting the threads of suspicion weave together, certain that the next day would bring clarity, if only she watched closely enough. Chapter 4. The Suspect's Shadows. The morning after Monsieur Dubois' disappearance dawned with a restless energy over Chateau Vigne. The vineyards, bathed in soft light, seemed to mock the tension within the chateau's walls. Miss Jane Marple sat at the breakfast table, her hands folded around a cup of tea, her eyes as sharp as the sunlight glinting off the silverware. The room, with its long mahogany table and crystal chandelier, was a study in elegance, yet the atmosphere was heavy with suspicion. The other guests, Madame Claudine Lefebvre, Monsieur Gaston Renard, Mademoiselle Sophie Martel, and Pierre Bouchard, ate in near silence, their glances darting like sparrows, wary and quick. Sir Henry Clithering, seated beside Miss Marple, leaned close, his voice low. "This business is getting murkier, Jane. Laurent's convinced Dubois fled with the Lafitte, but that cufflink bothers me. It's too convenient." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind alert. "Convenience, Sir Henry, is often a sign of design. Someone wishes us to believe a story, but the truth lies in the details they overlook." Her gaze drifted to the others, noting the small tells that betrayed their unease. Madame Lefebvre, her emerald dress replaced by a severe navy suit, cut her croissant with surgical precision, her lips pressed thin. Reynard, his florid face flushed from a glass of morning claret, muttered about the incompetence of the police. Sophie, her dark curls slightly disheveled, pushed her food around her plate, her locket absent from her throat, a detail Miss Marple tucked away. Pierre at the table's end ate methodically, his eyes fixed on his plate, as if avoiding the room's charged atmosphere. Inspecteur Laurent entered, his mustache bristling with purpose. He announced that the search of the grounds had yielded no further clues, and his men were now combing the chateau's upper rooms. "We will question each of you again today," he said, his tone sharp. "If Monsieur Dubois has been harmed, or if this is a theft, the truth will surface." His eyes lingered on Reynard, who bristled but said nothing. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted the inspecteur's focus on the obvious, a habit she knew often blinded men to subtler truths. After breakfast, Sir Henry suggested a walk in the gardens to clear their minds, and Miss Marple agreed, her shawl draped over her shoulders. The paths wound through rose beds and past a fountain, its gentle splash a contrast to the morning's tension. As they strolled, Sir Henry shared what he knew of the suspects, his voice low to avoid the ears of a passing gardener. "Dubois built his fortune from nothing," he said. "Started as a clerk in a wine merchant's office, learned the trade, and outbid everyone to amass his collection. Reynard's his opposite. Old money, but his own cellar's a shadow of Dubois. They've clashed at auctions for years. Reynard once accused Dubois of bribing a seller to secure a rare Bordeaux." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on a cluster of lavender. "Envy is a cruel master," she murmured. "And Madame Lefebvre?" Sir Henry frowned. "She's a buyer for a Paris auction house, represents wealthy clients. Word is, she was after the Lafitte for a Russian oligarch, willing to pay a king's ransom. Dubois was playing hardball, though, wanted more than her client offered." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Money makes people bold, but also careless." "And Sophie?" she prompted, her tone gentle. Sir Henry shrugged. "Young, ambitious, but an enigma. She came to the chateau a year ago, recommended by a friend of Dubois. Her past is vague. Some say she studied in Paris, others that she's from a local family. She knows the cellar inside out, though." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Knowledge is a tool, Sir Henry, and tools can be turned to many purposes." She paused, then added, "And Pierre?" "Local man, born in the village," Sir Henry said. "His family's worked the estate for generations. Loyal, but Dubois owes him back wages. Times have been lean for the workers. Pierre's quiet, but there's a resentment there, I'd wager." Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling Pierre's tense silence in the cellar. "Resentment," she said softly, "is a seed that grows in silence." They returned to the chateau, where Laurent had set up in the library for interviews. Miss Marple, not summoned, took a seat by a window overlooking the vineyards. Her knitting resumed. She watched as each suspect was called, their absences giving her time to reflect. Sophie went first, her steps hesitant. When she returned, her face was pale, and she avoided Miss Marple's gaze, hurrying to the hall. Madame Lefebvre followed, her posture rigid, her answers to Laurent's questions audible through the door, cool, precise, and deflecting. Reynard's interview was louder, his voice rising in indignation as he denied any grudge against Dubois. Pierre, Last spoke so quietly, Miss Marple could hear nothing, but his slumped shoulders when he emerged spoke of burdens unspoken. Seizing a moment, Miss Marple approached Madame Lefebvre in the hall, her manner disarming. "Such a lovely chateau," she said, as if chatting about the weather. "You must see many fine estates in your work." Lefebvre's guard lowered slightly, and she nodded. "Yes, but few like this. Dubois' collection is unique. My client was most eager for the Lafitte." Her tone was neutral, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of frustration in her eyes. "A pity it's gone," Miss Marple said gently. "Such a loss." Lefebvre's lips tightened, and she excused herself, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. Next, Miss Marple found Reynard in the smoking room, puffing a cigar. "Dreadful business, isn't it?" she said, her voice frail but her eyes keen. Reynard grunted, his cigar smoke curling upward. "Dubois always had a flair for drama, probably staged this to spite me." His bitterness was palpable, and Miss Marple noted his use of me, as if the disappearance were a personal slight. "You've known him long?" she asked. "Too long," Reynard snapped. "He's cheated me at every turn, hoarding bottles I'd have displayed for the world." His hand shook slightly, and Miss Marple smiled sympathetically, filing away his resentment. Sophie, encountered in the garden later, was more guarded. "You must find this all so upsetting, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone maternal. Sophie nodded, her fingers brushing where her locket had been. "Monsieur Dubois was kind to me, but demanding. He expected perfection." Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple sensed a story behind her hesitation, perhaps a fear of Dubois' temper or something deeper. Pierre proved hardest to draw out. Miss Marple found him near the stables, polishing a harness. "You've lived here all your life, haven't you?" she asked, her voice warm. He nodded, his eyes on his work. "My father worked these vines, and his father before him. It's home." His tone was flat, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of pride, tinged with something darker, perhaps anger at unpaid wages or loyalty strained by hardship. "It must be hard when times are lean," she said gently. Pierre's hands stilled, but he said nothing, his silence a wall she could not yet breach. That evening, as the group gathered for dinner, the air was thick with unspoken accusations. Laurent joined them, his presence a reminder of the ongoing investigation. Miss Marple, seated beside Sir Henry, watched as Reynard and Lefebvre exchanged barbed remarks about the wine trade, while Sophie picked at her food and Pierre avoided eye contact. The meal was interrupted by a gendarme, who whispered to Laurent. The inspecteur's face tightened, and he excused himself, leaving the group in a murmur of speculation. Later, in the drawing room, Sir Henry confided to Miss Marple that Laurent had found a scrap of paper in the cellar, a receipt for a wine shipment, dated the previous week, signed by Dubois, but addressed to an unknown buyer. "It's odd," Sir Henry said. "Dubois never mentioned selling anything recently." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Odd indeed," she said, "but people reveal themselves in what they hide as much as what they show." As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple retired to her room, her knitting bag in hand. She sat by the window, the vineyards dark under a crescent moon. The suspects, she thought, were like the threads in her scarf, each distinct, yet tangled in a pattern only patience could unravel. Lefebvre's ambition, Reynard's envy, Sophie's secrets, Pierre's silence, all were clues, as clear as the scuff mark in the cellar. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how small resentments could spark great crimes. Here, in the shadow of Chateau Vigne, the stakes were higher, but the human heart was no different. She closed her eyes, letting the pattern form, certain that the next thread would lead her closer to the truth. Chapter 5. A Clue in the Dust. The morning sun filtered through the chateau's tall windows, casting long shadows across the parquet floors, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill of uncertainty that lingered over Chateau Vigne. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in a simple gray dress with a cameo brooch, sat in the morning room, her knitting needles moving rhythmically as she observed the comings and goings of the household. The other guests were restless, their faces drawn from a sleepless night, and the presence of Inspecteur Laurent's gendarmes, stationed at every exit, only heightened the tension. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind their mild expression, noted the small signs of strain. Madame Claudine Lefebvre's taut posture, Monsieur Gaston Renard's forced joviality, Mademoiselle Sophie Martel's distracted glances, and Pierre Bouchard's continued silence, as if he carried a weight too heavy for words. Sir Henry Clithering joined her, his brow furrowed. "Jane, this case is a devil's knot," he said, keeping his voice low. "Laurent's men have turned the cellar upside down, and still no sign of Dubois or the Lafitte. That cufflink by the vineyard, it's too neat, don't you think?" Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing briefly. "Neatness, sir, Henry, is often a lie's calling card. A man fleeing in haste doesn't leave a polished cufflink behind. We must look where the story falters." Her gaze drifted to the window, where the vineyards stretched toward the horizon, their orderly rows hiding secrets beneath their calm. Determined to revisit the cellar, Miss Marple suggested to Sir Henry that they join the morning search, framing it as a desire to understand the chateau's history. Laurent, though skeptical of her involvement, permitted it, provided a gendarme accompanied them. The cellar, now brightly lit by lanterns, had lost some of its mystique, but its stone arches and dusty racks still held an air of secrecy. As the group descended, Miss Marple lagged behind, her steps deliberate, her eyes fixed on the barrel where she'd noticed the scuff mark the previous day. The gendarme, a young man with a bored expression, paid her little mind, allowing her to linger. The barrel, heavy and weathered, stood slightly askew, its base not quite aligned with its neighbors. Miss Marple knelt as if to tie her shoelace, and ran her fingers along the floor, confirming the crescent-shaped mark in the dust. It was fresh, undisturbed by the gendarme's heavy boots, suggesting recent movement. She glanced at the barrel's side, noting a faint scratch on its wood, as if it had been shifted with force. Rising, she caught Sir Henry's eye and beckoned him over, her voice soft. "This barrel, Sir Henry, does it seem out of place to you?" He frowned, inspecting it. "It's a bit crooked, but these cellars are old. Could be nothing." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Or everything. In my village, a misplaced teacup once led to a confession of theft. Small things speak loudly. If we listen." She stepped back, her eyes scanning the wall behind the barrel. The stonework was uneven, and one panel, barely distinguishable, seemed to sit lower than the rest, its edges worn smooth by touch rather than time. She pressed it lightly, her fingers cautious, and felt a slight give, as if the panel concealed a mechanism. Sir Henry, catching her intent, distracted the gendarme with a question about the cellar's construction. Seizing the moment, Miss Marple pressed harder, and the panel slid inward with a soft click, revealing a narrow opening just wide enough for a person to pass. Beyond lay a tunnel, its walls damp and its air stale, stretching upward into darkness. She stepped back, her heart quickening, and signaled Sir Henry to join her. His eyes widened as he peered into the passage. "Good heavens, Jane," he whispered. "A secret tunnel. This changes everything." Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm but her mind racing. "It explains how a man might vanish from a locked chamber, but we mustn't speak of it yet, not until we know where it leads." Sir Henry agreed, his face grim. They rejoined the group, Miss Marple's demeanor unchanged, though her thoughts were now fixed on the tunnel's purpose. Had Dubois been taken through it, or had he used it himself? And why was the Lafitte missing, if not to fuel the deception? Back in the chateau, Miss Marple sought out Sophie, finding her in the library, sorting papers with trembling hands. "You know this estate well, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "These old houses often have hidden corners, don't they?" Sophie's eyes flickered with unease, but she nodded. "The chateau's full of stories, passages from the war when smugglers used them." Her voice was too quick, and Miss Marple noted the way her hands stilled, as if guarding a secret. "Fascinating," Miss Marple said, smiling. "I suppose you've explored them all, working here." Sophie's flush deepened, and she murmured an excuse, hurrying away. The afternoon brought Laurent's latest findings, a set of footprints in the vineyard, leading toward the outbuildings but fading on rocky ground. He declared them Dubois', though Miss Marple, invited to view them, noted their size seemed larger than the collector's slight frame. She said nothing, but her suspicions grew. The cufflink, the footprints, the receipt Sir Henry had mentioned, all were pieces of a puzzle, but their edges didn't yet align. At luncheon, the group's tension was palpable. Reynard, attempting levity, recounted a tale of a rival's ruined vintage, his laughter forced. Madame Lefebvre, her eyes cold, countered with a story of a stolen bottle at auction, her words pointed. Sophie barely spoke, her gaze fixed on her plate, while Pierre, seated at the table's edge, ate in silence, his eyes darting to the door whenever a gendarme passed. Miss Marple, nibbling a slice of quiche, engaged each in turn, her questions innocuous but probing. To Lefebvre, she asked about the challenges of authenticating rare wines. To Reynard, she inquired about his own collection's highlights. To Sophie, she spoke of the chateau's history. To Pierre, she mentioned the beauty of the vineyards. Each answer revealed a sliver of truth. Lefebvre's ambition, Reynard's bitterness, Sophie's fear, Pierre's restraint. As the meal ended, Miss Marple excused herself, claiming a need for fresh air. She wandered to the outbuildings where the tunnel might emerge, her steps slow to avoid attention. The old servants' quarters, half hidden by ivy, were locked, but she noted a window with a cracked pane, as if recently forced. She made a mental note to return with Sir Henry, certain the tunnel's exit lay nearby. That evening, as the group gathered in the drawing room, Laurent announced a new theory. Dubois had staged his disappearance to protect the Lafitte from theft, perhaps hiding in the village. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, listened as the others reacted. Lefebvre's skeptical frown, Reynard's derisive snort, Sophie's nervous glance, Pierre's impassive stare. She spoke little, but her mind was alive with possibilities. The tunnel, she thought, was the key, but its user remained elusive. Was it Dubois, fleeing with his prize, or another, orchestrating a darker plan? As the group dispersed, Sir Henry lingered, his voice low. "You've found something, Jane, haven't you?" She smiled, her needles clicking. "Only a thread, Sir Henry, but threads lead to patterns. In St. Mary Mead, a hidden door once solved a theft. Here, I suspect, it may unlock more than we expect." She rose, her shawl draped neatly, and retired to her room, her thoughts on the tunnel and the shadows it concealed. The truth, she knew, was close, waiting only for the right moment to step into the light. Chapter 6. Motives and Masks. The late afternoon light bathed Chateau Vigne in a golden glow, softening the stone facade, but doing little to ease the undercurrent of suspicion that pulsed through its halls. Miss Jane Marple sat in the chateau's conservatory, a glass-walled haven filled with potted ferns and the faint scent of citrus. Her knitting lay in her lap, a delicate lace shawl taking shape, but her eyes were fixed on the garden beyond, where the shadows of the cypress trees stretched long and thin. The events of the morning, the discovery of the tunnel, the cracked window in the servants' quarters, had sharpened her focus, yet the puzzle of Monsieur Dubois' disappearance remained tantalizingly incomplete. She knew the truth lay not in the grand gestures, but in the small, unguarded moments of those around her. The other guests, confined to the chateau by Inspecteur Laurent's orders, moved through the day with a restlessness that bordered on agitation. At luncheon, the dining room had been a stage for veiled accusations. Madame Claudine Lefebvre's sharp remarks about the wine trade's greed, Monsieur Gaston Renard's loud complaints about the police's incompetence, Mademoiselle Sophie Martel's faltering attempts at calm, and Pierre Bouchard's stoic silence, his eyes betraying a flicker of unease when the conversation turned to the cellar. Miss Marple, her demeanor as unassuming as ever, had listened carefully, her mind cataloging each word and glance like stitches in her pattern. Now, in the conservatory, she turned her attention to the suspect's motives, piecing together the fragments she had gathered. Sir Henry Clithering, ever her ally, joined her, settling into a wicker chair with a sigh. "Jane, this case is like a vintage gone sour," he said, his voice low. "Laurent's chasing footprints and cufflinks, but I can't shake the feeling we're missing the heart of it. That tunnel you found, it's a game changer, but who used it?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "The heart, Sir Henry, is always in the people. Motives are like roots, hidden, but they feed the actions above. We must dig a little deeper." She began with Madame Lefebvre, whom she'd observed earlier in the library, poring over a catalogue of rare wines. Approaching her, with a gentle smile, Miss Marple had remarked, "You must find such joy in your work, madame, connecting treasures with those who value them." Lefebvre, her guard momentarily lowered, had nodded. "It's a passion, Mademoiselle Marple, but a costly one. My client's offer for the Lafitte was generous, millions in fact, but Dubois refused. He wanted more, always more." Her tone had carried a hint of frustration, and Miss Marple had noted the way her fingers tightened on the catalogue, as if grasping for something just out of reach. A commission of such magnitude, Miss Marple mused, could drive ambition to dangerous heights. Next, she had sought out Renard, finding him in the billiard room, his cigar smoke curling toward the ceiling. "This must be trying for you, monsieur," she'd said, her voice sympathetic. "To be so close to such a collection, yet caught in this mystery." Renard had scoffed, his face reddening. "Dubois has made a fool of me for years, outbidding me, flaunting his Lafitte. If he's run off, it's to spite me. Mark my words." His bitterness was raw, and Miss Marple had seen the flash of envy in his eyes, a fire that could burn through reason. His rivalry with Dubois, she thought, was not just professional but personal. A wound festered over years of perceived slights. Sophie proved more elusive, her duties keeping her busy, but Miss Marple caught her in the hall carrying a tray of tea things. "You've been so brave, my dear, with all this upheaval," Miss Marple had said, her tone maternal. Sophie's smile was strained, her eyes darting to the floor. "It's my job to keep things running, mademoiselle, but Monsieur Dubois, he was strict. Everything had to be perfect, or he'd notice." Her voice held a tremor, and Miss Marple wondered what lay behind her fear, perhaps a mistake she feared exposed, or a secret Dubois held over her. The absence of her locket, so often clutched, suggested a loss of comfort, or perhaps a deliberate shedding of a clue. Pierre, as always, was the hardest to reach. Miss Marple found him in the vineyard, pruning vines with a steady hand. "This must be a peaceful place to work," she'd said, her voice warm. He nodded, his eyes on the grapes. "It's honest work, but the chateau's not what it was. Dubois promised wages, but the money's late. My family, we need it." His words were clipped, his resentment clear, yet his loyalty to the estate seemed unshaken. Miss Marple, watching his calloused hands, sensed a man torn between duty and desperation, a combination that could push one to extremes. As the day wore on, Miss Marple joined Sir Henry for a walk along the chateau's perimeter, her shawl draped against the evening's chill. They paused near the outbuildings, where the cracked window in the servants' quarters caught her eye again. "This tunnel, Jane," Sir Henry said, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "It must lead here. But why take Dubois? And why the Lafitte?" Miss Marple's eyes followed the path to the vineyards. "The bottle is the key, I think. It's not just its value, it's what it represents. To one, it's wealth, to another, prestige, to a third, perhaps a way to settle a score." Their conversation was interrupted by a shout from the vineyard. A gendarme approached, holding a small cloth bundle. "Inspector Laurent wishes you to see this," he said, leading them to the drawing room, where Laurent waited. The bundle, unwrapped, revealed a torn scrap of fabric, dark blue with a faint pinstripe, matching Dubois' jacket. "Found near the outbuildings," Laurent said, his voice triumphant. "It suggests a struggle, perhaps an escape." Miss Marple, examining the fabric, noted its clean edges, as if torn deliberately. "Curious," she said softly, "that it's so intact for something caught in a struggle." Laurent, undeterred, announced plans to search the village, believing Dubois might be hiding there. The group, gathered for dinner, reacted with predictable unease. Lefebvre's skeptical frown, Renard's loud insistence that Dubois was mocking them all, Sophie's nervous fidgeting, Pierre's silent withdrawal. Miss Marple, her meal barely touched, watched them closely, her mind turning over the fabric, the tunnel, and the motives she'd uncovered. Each suspect, she thought, wore a mask, but masks slipped in unguarded moments. After dinner, she lingered in the drawing room, engaging Sophie in a quiet chat about the chateau's history. "These old estates," Miss Marple said, "must have many stories, hidden rooms, secret deals." Sophie nodded, her eyes wary. "There are tales, yes, passages from the old days used for private matters." Her hesitation confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. Sophie knew of the tunnel, or something like it, and her silence was a choice. Lefebvre, passing by, paused to comment on the Lafitte's rarity, her voice cool, but her eyes sharp, as if testing the room's reaction. Renard, nursing a brandy, muttered about Dubois' arrogance, while Pierre, standing by the door, seemed to shrink from the conversation. As the evening closed, Miss Marple retired to her room, her knitting bag in hand. She sat by the window, the vineyards dark under a starlit sky. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how greed and envy could twist even the simplest hearts. Here, in the grandeur of Chateau Vigne, those passions were magnified, but no less predictable. The tunnel, the fabric, the missing locket, all were threads in a tapestry of deceit. Someone had planned Dubois' disappearance, and the Lafitte was either the prize or the bait. She closed her eyes, letting the pattern form, certain that the next day would bring her closer to the hand that wove it. Chapter 7. The Tunnel's Tale. The night hung heavy over Chateau Vigne, the moon a mere sliver casting faint light across the vineyards. Miss Jane Marple, her room, softly lit by a single lamp, sat by her window, her knitting idle for once. The discovery of the tunnel and the torn fabric had sharpened her sense of the mystery, like a pattern emerging from a tangle of threads. She knew the truth was close, but it required a delicate touch to unravel without snapping the fragile clues. The chateau slept, or so it seemed, but Miss Marple suspected at least one other was awake, plotting or fearing discovery. She rose, slipping on her shawl and sensible shoes, her movements quiet but purposeful. Earlier, she had confided in Sir Henry Clithering about the tunnel's entrance behind the barrel, and he had agreed to join her in a clandestine exploration under cover of darkness. They met in the corridor, his tall figure a shadow against the tapestried walls. "Jane, this is madness," he whispered, though his eyes sparkled with the thrill of the chase. "But I trust your instincts. Lead on." They descended to the cellar, avoiding the creaking floorboards and the watchful eyes of the gendarmes stationed at the chateau's main exits. The cellar was silent, its air cool and heavy with the scent of oak and earth. The lanterns from the day's search were gone, but Sir Henry carried a small torch, its beam cutting through the darkness. Miss Marple led him to the barrel, its scuff mark still visible in the dust. She pressed the hidden panel, and it slid open with a faint groan, revealing the tunnel's narrow mouth. "Careful, Sir Henry," she murmured. "We don't know who else might know this path." The tunnel was cramped, its walls damp and rough-hewn, smelling of mold and forgotten years. Miss Marple moved cautiously, her shawl catching on jagged stones, while Sir Henry followed, his torch illuminating cobwebs and the occasional rusted tool left by long-gone smugglers. The passage sloped upward, twisting slightly, and after a few minutes they reached a wooden door, its hinges rusted but intact. Sir Henry pushed it open, revealing a small, dusty room cluttered with crates and old furniture, the disused servants' quarters, just as Miss Marple had suspected. In the torchlight they found a crate tucked in a corner, its lid ajar. Inside, nestled in straw, was the missing 1787 Chateau Lafitte, its dark glass glinting like a jewel. Beside it lay another scrap of fabric, blue and pinstriped, matching Dubois' jacket. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind racing. "The bottle, but not the man," she said softly. "This is no accident, Sir Henry. Someone meant us to find this, or to believe they meant to hide it." Sir Henry frowned, examining the fabric. "It's torn, like the piece Laurent found, but too clean for a struggle. This feels staged, Jane. She nodded, her fingers brushing the crate's edge, noting a faint smear of grease, as if it had been handled recently. A stage needs actors, she said, and actors need a motive. The Lafitte is here, but Dubois is not. Why leave the prize and take the man? They searched the room further, finding no other clues, but Miss Marple noted the cracked window she'd seen earlier, its latch loose, suggesting an exit to the grounds. She filed this away, her thoughts turning to the suspects. Madame Claudine Lefebvre's ambition, Monsieur Gaston Renard's envy, Mademoiselle Sophie Martel's guarded fear, Pierre Bouchard's silent resentment. Each could have known the tunnel, each could have used it. But whose hand had placed the bottle here, and why? They retraced their steps, closing the panel carefully, and returned to their rooms undetected. Miss Marple, settling into her armchair, found a note slipped under her door, its paper plain and the writing clumsy, as if scrawled in haste. "Leave the chateau, or regret it." She showed it to Sir Henry, who bristled. "This is a threat, Jane. We must tell Laurent." She shook her head, her expression calm. "Not yet, Sir Henry. A threat is a sign of fear, and fear means we're close. Let them think we're unaware." The next morning, the chateau buzzed with renewed activity. Inspecteur Laurent, unaware of the night's discoveries, announced plans to search the village, convinced Dubois was hiding there. The group gathered in the drawing room, their faces a mix of fatigue and suspicion. Madame Lefebvre, her navy suit immaculate, questioned Laurent's logic with a sharp edge, suggesting the police were wasting time. Renard, his voice loud, scoffed at the idea of Dubois fleeing, insisting it was a trick to humiliate him. Sophie, her locket still missing, fidgeted with her sleeve, her eyes darting to the door. Pierre, as ever, stood apart, his gaze fixed on the floor, though Miss Marple noted his hands clenching briefly when the tunnel was mentioned in passing. Seizing a moment, Miss Marple approached Sophie, her tone gentle. "You must miss your locket, my dear," she said, watching closely. Sophie's hand flew to her throat, her face paling. "I lost it," she stammered. "It was nothing, just a trinket." But her eyes betrayed a lie, and Miss Marple smiled, letting the moment pass. To Lefebvre, she remarked on the beauty of the vineyards, drawing a curt response about their value to the estate's finances. Renard, when engaged, rambled about his own collection's superiority, his bitterness toward Dubois clear. Pierre, approached in the garden, spoke briefly of the estate's history, his words guarded, but his eyes flickering with something, anger, perhaps, or guilt. At luncheon, Laurent revealed a new clue. A villager had reported seeing a man resembling Dubois near the train station the night of the disappearance. The group reacted predictably. Lefebvre's skeptical frown, Renard's derisive laugh, Sophie's nervous glance, Pierre's silence. Miss Marple, her meal untouched, considered the sighting. It was too convenient, like the cufflink and the fabric, suggesting a trail laid to mislead. She thought of the tunnel, the bottle, the note. Each a piece of a puzzle designed to obscure the truth. As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple sat with Sir Henry in the conservatory, the glass walls reflecting the fading light. "Jane, this is a devil's game," he said. "The tunnel, the Lafitte, the note. Who's pulling the strings?" She smiled, her needles clicking. "Someone who thinks themselves clever, Sir Henry. In St. Mary Mead, I once solved a theft because a maid's apron was too clean. Here, The clues are too perfect, too placed. We must watch for the slip, the moment the mask falls. She retired early, her mind alive with possibilities. The tunnel had revealed the how, but the why remained elusive. The Lafitte left behind was either a mistake or a decoy, and the note suggested a desperate hand. As she gazed at the vineyards, dark under the stars, she felt the pattern tightening. The truth, she knew, was in the suspects' shadows, their motives, their fears, their lies. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would tug at the threads, certain one would unravel the mystery of Chateau Vigne. Chapter 8. The Rival's Gambit. The morning air at Chateau Vigne carried a crisp edge, hinting at autumn's approach. But within the chateau's walls, the atmosphere was thick with suspicion and the weight of unanswered questions. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, observed the group with her usual quiet attentiveness. The discovery of the tunnel and the Lafitte bottle, coupled with the threatening note slipped under her door, had sharpened her resolve. She knew the truth was near, hidden in the subtle cracks of the suspects' carefully constructed facades. Her needles clicked steadily, a counterpoint to the restless energy of Madame Claudine Lefebvre, Monsieur Gaston Renard, Mademoiselle Sophie Martel, and Pierre Bouchard, who sat scattered across the room, each avoiding the other's eyes. Sir Henry Clithering, ever her confidant, leaned close, his voice a whisper. "Jane, that note last night. It's a bold move. Someone's rattled, and I'd wager it's because of your tunnel find." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on her lace shawl. "Fear makes people reckless, Sir Henry. The note was meant to scare me off, but it only confirms we're close. We must press the advantage, but carefully." Her mind was already weaving a plan, one that would force the guilty party to reveal themselves through their own misstep. She proposed to Sir Henry a recreation of the cellar tour, ostensibly to help Inspecteur Laurent clarify the sequence of events. Laurent, though initially skeptical, agreed, seeing it as a chance to observe the suspects under pressure. Miss Marple's suggestion was framed with her characteristic humility, as if it were a mere whim of an elderly lady, but her eyes gleamed with purpose. "Sometimes," she said to Laurent, "seeing things again brings clarity, like rereading a favorite book." The inspecteur, his mustache twitching, consented, and the group was summoned to the cellar once more. The descent into the cellar was a somber affair, the torchlight casting long shadows that seemed to mimic the group's unease. Laurent led the way, his gendarmes stationed at the entrance, while Miss Marple walked beside Sir Henry, her steps slow but deliberate. The barrel with the scuff mark drew her eye, but she kept her gaze soft, her demeanor unthreatening. Sophie, guiding the group as she had before, repeated her narration of the collection's history, but her voice lacked its earlier polish, stumbling over details. Madame Lefebvre, her posture rigid, asked no questions this time, her eyes scanning the racks as if searching for something, or someone. Reynard's bluster was subdued, his hands fidgeting with his pocket watch. Pierre, trailing behind, kept his eyes on the floor, his silence heavier than ever. As they reached the iron gate, Miss Marple paused, feigning a moment of fatigue. "Such a fascinating place," she said, her voice carrying to the group. "But so many corners, so many shadows. One could almost imagine hidden doors." She watched Sophie closely, noting the girl's sharp intake of breath, her hand twitching as if to clutch the missing locket. Reynard's eyes darted to the barrel, a fleeting glance Miss Marple caught and filed away. Laurent, impatient, urged them to continue, but Miss Marple lingered, her fingers brushing the barrel's edge, drawing attention to it. Seizing a moment when Laurent was distracted by a gendarme's report, Miss Marple slipped a small pebble from her pocket into Reynard's coat, hung on a nearby rack during the tour. It was a calculated risk, a test to see how he would react when confronted. She rejoined the group, her face serene, as they returned to the drawing room. There, Laurent announced no new insights from the recreation, but Miss Marple's plan was only beginning to unfold. Later that afternoon, she confided in Sir Henry, asking him to suggest a search of the guests' rooms to Laurent, framing it as a routine precaution. Laurent, eager for progress, agreed, and the gendarmes moved swiftly. When they reached Reynard's room, the pebble was found in his coat pocket, alongside a scrap of paper with a map of the chateau's grounds, marked with a path to the outbuildings. Reynard's face reddened as he protested, his voice rising. "This is absurd. Someone planted this. I've never seen it before." His outrage was convincing, but Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, the way his eyes avoided hers. Laurent, intrigued by the find, ordered a search of Reynard's car, parked in the chateau's courtyard. Miss Marple, standing by the window with her knitting, watched as the gendarmes approached the vehicle. Moments later, a shout rang out, and Laurent emerged, his face grim. In the car's trunk, hidden under a blanket, was Monsieur Etienne Dubois, bound but alive, his eyes wide with relief and fear. Beside him was a case of lesser bottles, clearly intended for smuggling. The Lafitte, however, was not among them. The drawing room became a scene of chaos as the group was summoned. Dubois, freed and given water, recounted his ordeal in a hoarse voice. "I was in the cellar, by the gate, when I heard the crash. Someone grabbed me from behind, a cloth over my face, chloroform, I think. I woke in the tunnel, then was moved to the car." His eyes fixed on Reynard, who stood rigid, his face a mask of defiance. Laurent turned to Reynard, his voice cold. "Explain this, monsieur." Cornered, Reynard's bluster collapsed. "It was a mistake," he stammered. "I only wanted the Lafitte, to ruin him, to take what he valued most. I used the tunnel, yes, but I didn't mean to hurt him." He admitted to staging the crash with Sophie's help, confessing she'd been coerced after he threatened to expose a past indiscretion, a theft from a previous employer. The Lafitte, he claimed, was left in the tunnel to throw off suspicion, a decoy to suggest theft rather than kidnapping. Miss Marple, her knitting needles still, spoke softly. "Envy, Monsieur Reynard, is a dangerous muse. You couldn't bear his success, could you?" Her voice was gentle, but her words cut, and Reynard's shoulders slumped, his confession complete. Sophie, tears streaming, admitted her role, her fear of exposure outweighing her loyalty. Pierre and Lefebvre, though tempted by their own desires, were cleared, their motives not extending to such a drastic act. As the gendarmes led Reynard away, Sir Henry turned to Miss Marple, his admiration clear. "Jane, you're a marvel. That pebble, how did you know?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "In Saint. Mary Mead, a misplaced button once betrayed a thief. Here, a pebble served the same purpose. People, Sir Henry, are predictable in their panic." She resumed her knitting, the pattern complete, the mystery unraveled by the simplest of threads. Chapter 9. The Denouement. The grand drawing room of Chateau Vigne, with its gilded mirrors and tapestries, was bathed in the soft glow of evening lamps, yet an air of resolution hung over the gathered group. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance with the relief of a mystery solved. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair, her knitting bag at her side, her hands folded calmly as she surveyed the room. Monsieur Etienne Dubois, pale but composed after his ordeal, sat near Sir Henry Clithering, his sharp eyes softened by gratitude. Madame Claudine Lefebvre, her usual poise restored, sipped a glass of claret, while Mademoiselle Sophie Martel, her face still marked by tearful remorse, sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly. Pierre Bouchard stood by the window, his expression unreadable, but his posture less rigid than before. Inspecteur Laurent, his mustache impeccably groomed, stood at the room's center, ready to close the case, but it was Miss Marple whom all eyes turned to, sensing her quiet authority. Sir Henry, his voice warm with admiration, broke the silence. "Miss Marple, you've worked a miracle here. Perhaps you'd do us the honor of explaining how you unraveled this tangle?" His request was met with nods from Dubois, and even a reluctant glance from Laurent, who, though proud, recognized her insight. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with the modesty that masked her keen mind. "It's no miracle, Sir Henry," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Merely a matter of watching people, as I do in my little village of St. Mary Mead. Human nature, you see, is much the same, whether in a cottage or a chateau." She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on her lap. From the start, Monsieur Dubois' disappearance seemed too perfect, too staged. A locked gate, a missing bottle, a cufflink left in the vineyard, all pointed to a story someone wanted us to believe. But stories, like knitting, must hold together, and this one had loose threads. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room, noting Sophie's nervous fidgeting and Lefebvre's attentive stare. The cufflink, found so conveniently by the vineyard, was too clean, too polished for a man fleeing in haste, she continued. "In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a gardener who left a pristine handkerchief at a theft scene to mislead us. It didn't fool anyone for long. Here, the cufflink suggested someone wished us to think Monsieur Dubois had escaped, perhaps with the Lafitte. But why leave such a valuable bottle behind as we found it in the tunnel?" She turned to Dubois, her expression gentle. "Your collection, monsieur, is not just wine. It's a symbol of triumph, of status. To some, it's a prize worth stealing. To others, a wound to their pride." Her eyes flicked to the empty chair where Reynard would have sat, now in custody. Monsieur Reynard's envy was clear from the moment we arrived. His loud complaints, his bitter remarks about your success, they were not mere rivalry, but a grudge nursed over years. He saw the Lafitte as the ultimate trophy, a way to diminish you. Miss Marple's needles, resting in her bag, seemed to underscore her calm precision. The tunnel was the key, of course. When I saw the scuff mark by the barrel, I suspected a hidden passage. Old houses like this often have them, as I've learned from village gossip about smugglers' haunts. The tunnel led to the servants' quarters, where we found the Lafitte and a scrap of your jacket, Monsieur Dubois. But the fabric, like the cufflink, was too clean, too deliberately placed. It was meant to suggest theft, not kidnapping. She paused, letting her words settle. The crash in the cellar, the fallen crate, was no accident. It was a distraction, orchestrated to give Reynard his moment. He knew the tunnel, likely from his visits to the chateau over the years, and used it to spirit you away, Monsieur Dubois, while we were all turned toward Sophie's departure. The chloroform, the quick move to the car, It was bold, but reckless. He meant to hold you until he could secure the Lafitte and ruin your reputation, perhaps by claiming you'd stolen it yourself. Sophie, her face flushed, looked down, and Miss Marple's tone softened. Mademoiselle Martel, you were drawn into this unwillingly, weren't you? Reynard knew something of your past, a small indiscretion, perhaps, from before you came here. He used it to ensure your silence, to make you stage the crash. Your fear was evident, my dear, in your missing locket, your trembling hands. But you didn't know the full extent of his plan, did you? Sophie shook her head, tears welling. I only dropped the crate, she whispered. I didn't know he'd hurt anyone. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind but unyielding. Madame Lefebvre, your ambition was clear, but your interest was in acquiring the Lafitte legally for your client. Your sharp questions, your frustration with Dubois' refusal, they were honest, if driven by gain. And Pierre, she said, turning to the silent worker, your resentment was real, born of unpaid wages and family burdens, but your loyalty to this estate held you back. You knew the tunnel, didn't you, from childhood stories? But you didn't use it. Pierre nodded, his voice low. I knew of it, but I'd never betray the chateau. Laurent, his notebook open, interjected. But how did you know it was Reynard, Mademoiselle Marple? The pebble in his pocket, that was your doing? Miss Marple smiled faintly. A small test, Inspecteur. In my village, I once caught a thief by placing a button where he'd find it. People betray themselves when startled. Reynard's reaction, his loud protests, his quick denial. It showed his guilt. The map in his pocket, the bottles in his car, they confirmed it. He meant to smuggle lesser wines, leaving the Lafitte as a false trail, but he underestimated the simplicity of human error. Dubois, his voice hoarse, spoke up. Mademoiselle Marple, I owe you my life. That bottle, it's nothing compared to this. He gestured to the room, his eyes moist. I was a fool to let pride blind me to such dangers. Miss Marple shook her head. Pride, monsieur, is a common fault, but envy is its crueler cousin. Reynard couldn't bear your light shining brighter. As the group dispersed, Laurent promising to handle Sophie's minor role with leniency, Sir Henry lingered, his admiration plain. Jane, you've outdone yourself. That pebble, it was a stroke of genius. She chuckled softly, retrieving her knitting. Not genius, Sir Henry, just observation. People are like patterns, predictable if you know their stitches. In St. Mary Mead, a glance can reveal a heart. Here, it took only a little more watching. The Lafitte, returned to its pedestal in the cellar, gleamed once more under torchlight, and Chateau Vigne settled into a quieter rhythm. Miss Marple, her work done, felt the familiar satisfaction of a puzzle solved, but her thoughts were already turning to home, where simpler mysteries awaited. Chapter 10. The Return to St. Mary Mead. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over the rolling vineyards of Chateau Vigne, its golden light softening the stone towers and lending a serene air to the estate. The tension that had gripped the chateau for days had dissipated, replaced by a quiet relief, though the echoes of the mystery lingered in the minds of those who remained. Miss Jane Marple, her modest suitcase packed, stood in the courtyard, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. Her knitting bag, ever present, hung from her arm, a silent companion to her thoughts. The tour, with its promise of fine wines and finer intrigues, had delivered more than she'd anticipated, and now, as she prepared to depart, she felt the satisfaction of a puzzle neatly solved. Sir Henry Clithering, his robust figure clad in a tweed suit, joined her, his face alight with admiration. "Jane, you've been the hero of this adventure," he said, his voice warm. "Without you, Dubois might still be languishing in that car, and Renard would be halfway to Paris with his ill-gotten gains." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with modesty. "Nonsense, Sir Henry. I only saw what was there to see. People, you know, are much the same everywhere, whether in a French vineyard or my little village. Their desires, their fears, they leave traces, like footprints in a garden." Monsieur Etienne Dubois approached, his wiry frame less tense than before, though his sharp eyes still carried a trace of wariness. He took Miss Marple's hand, bowing slightly. "Mademoiselle, I cannot thank you enough. My collection, my life, they are safe because of you." He gestured toward the chateau, where the 1787 Chateau Lafite had been restored to its pedestal. "I've learned a lesson, I think, to value what I have without flaunting it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind. "A lesson well learned, monsieur. Pride is a fine thing, but it invites envy, and envy is a thief in the night." Madame Claudine Lefebvre, her emerald dress replaced by a tailored traveling coat, offered a crisp nod of farewell. Her ambition, though unchecked, had been innocent of the crime, and she seemed eager to return to Paris, perhaps to chase another rare vintage. Mademoiselle Sophie Martel, her face softer now that her minor role had been forgiven, murmured a shy thank you, her locket once again at her throat. A sign, Miss Marple thought, of her reclaimed peace. Pierre Bouchard, lingering by the vineyard's edge, gave a curt nod, his loyalty to the estate reaffirmed, though his eyes held a lingering shadow of the hardships he'd endured. Inspecteur Laurent, his mustache as meticulous as ever, approached to bid farewell. "Mademoiselle Marple, you have taught me to look beyond the obvious," he said, a rare humility in his tone. "I shall not forget this case." Miss Marple smiled gently. "You're very kind, Inspecteur, but the truth is always there, waiting for a patient eye. In my village, a misplaced teacup once solved a mystery. Here, it was a scuff mark and a pebble." The chauffeured car arrived, its engine purring softly, and Miss Marple climbed in, Sir Henry insisting on accompanying her to the station at Avignon. As they drove through the Provençal countryside, the fields of lavender and sunflowers unfolded like a painting, their beauty a stark contrast to the dark motives she'd unraveled. Sir Henry, ever curious, pressed her for details. "Jane, how did you know the tunnel was the key, and that pebble, such a simple trick?" She chuckled, her hands folded in her lap. "In St. Mary Mead, Sir Henry, I once caught a poacher because he left a feather in a trap. Simple things betray us because we overlook them. The tunnel was a secret too old to stay hidden, and Renard's panic when the pebble was found showed his hand." The train station was bustling, its platform alive with travelers and the whistle of departing locomotives. Sir Henry carried her suitcase, his gallantry undimmed. "You'll be back to your roses and your gossip soon, Jane," he said, a teasing note in his voice. "Will you miss the excitement of Chateau Vigne?" She shook her head, her eyes on the horizon. "Excitement is overrated, Sir Henry. My garden needs tending, and my neighbors' little dramas are puzzle enough. But I'll carry this adventure in my memory like a good bottle of wine, best savored in recollection." The train's whistle sounded, and Miss Marple boarded, settling into her compartment with her knitting bag. As the countryside rolled by, she opened it, her needles resuming their familiar rhythm. The mystery of the vanished wine collector had been a diversion, a glimpse into a world of wealth and rivalry, but it had reaffirmed her belief in the predictability of human nature. Greed, envy, fear. They were the same in St. Mary Mead as in Provence, differing only in scale. She closed her eyes, the click of her needles blending with the train's gentle sway, already anticipating the quiet of her cottage and the next small mystery that awaited her there.